Hey guys, my name's Miss Catherine, and this is the first episode of my new series, First Chapter. In this series, I'll be reading the first chapters of books that I find really interesting or that I think aren't getting enough attention that they deserve. Check back every week for new episodes and new first chapters. So this week, our first book is called Straight On Till Morning. It's by Liz Braswell. It is actually a Disney-endorsed book. And Liz Braswell writes twisted fairy tales. So she writes books that are like retellings of fairy tales from a new perspective. So I thought this would be a great candidate for our first chapter series. So I am going to skip the prologue. I think I'm going to save that for you to read when you check out this book. All right, the first chapter, London. Yes, it's a scene recreated so often that it has almost become a caricature of a trope, but let's go through the process once again anyway, because it's necessary, even to this story. Low clouds do not blanket the sky, for that implies coziness and comfort. No, these clouds mask the sky, weigh on the sky, choke the sky. They are strengthened by smoke from below, the trickling upward effluence of 100,000 chimneys that decorate the landscape like unhealthily angular flowers. The slate and clay shingled, higgly-piggly rooftops seem to extend forever in an industrial upside-down version of the fairy tale hills and the dales in a children's book with bright pictures and bad perspective. Everything is in shades of gray and black. A great gray river slinks through the city like a tired but friendly snake, hobbled by bridges far less impressive than their names imply. Don't believe me? Look up London Bridge and gaze at its pictures, in utter disappointment. Of course, there's Big Ben, a giant clock with equally giant gunmetal and copper hands that an astounding number of fictional characters have wound up standing on at one time or another. Its bells, along with all the church bells of the city, toll the hour menacingly, with the obvious mournful implication of time passing, death coming, soup's getting cold. On the cobbled streets below the towers and rooftops, weather has some impact and energy. The almost rain and morning mist combine to make a wet, stinging atmosphere that has men swirling into greatcoats, nannies bundling up their charges, and mums shouting, "Come out of the garden, you'll catch your death in the fog." Also, many umbrellas. So many black umbrellas with the usual spindly frames, like insects or skeletons or whatever, that watching them pass is almost torturously jejune. There, London. End of one century, beginning of another. Got it? Good. Halfway between where the umbrellas ended and where the sky should have started, maybe 20.5 feet below the tallest chimney, was one particular casement window. Gazing out of it was a young woman in an unfashionable pale blue dress. Her hair was a popular shade of brown, and her eyes an exquisitely normal blue for the time and place. At first, she looked up at the sky, but it was impossible to make out any shapes in the clouds because of their utter completion, filling the heavens from one end to the other in the same unbroken shade. So she looked down, but the dismal garden below soaked up the wet like a moldy sponge. There were no puddles, no reflections. The tree was sodden. Nothing in this stolidly real vista was alterable by even the strongest imagination. There was no foothold for pirates, fairies, golden carriages, knights, or even a hint of swashbuckling. Someone from the street had thrown a brown banana skin over the fence, and there it lay, out of place in the English yard, attesting to the banality of global commerce and how it didn't bring with it sultans or magic horses. Only bananas. Wendy sighed and turned from the window. Afternoons were the hardest. In the mornings, she still saw her tutor, and there were chores and writing exercises. After elevenses was a good improving book recommended by the bookseller, the one with the handsome nephew. By then, Miss Darling had usually either gone to pay visits or was busily engaged in correspondence with her delicate blue pen at her elegant secretary. The gloom never seemed to affect her, even if she did stay home all day. She was always gracefully and slowly attending to some task or another, her face, her sewing, her little expense book she kept for the house, the pantry, their unpredictable cook, Mary. Wendy still enjoyed it when Miss Darling included her in some of her feminine rituals, which usually involved the proper application of powders and creams, tips on how to polish her nails, or ideas for sprucing up an old beau. She loved it when they had enough extra house money to go for a fancy tea out at Sacklebury's, just the two of them. Wendy would admire her mother smiling and laughing between her many times renewed hat, and would think once again that she was the most beautiful mother in the world. She wondered when she herself would attain that delicate beauty, confidence, and perfection of manner. But these outings were rare, and anyway, even the most appealing things lost their glamour when held up to the imaginary delights of Neverland. Wendy turned to her bureau. Normally she tried to resist until the end of the day as a sort of reward, like the opera creams her mother secretly indulged in. Miss Darling smiled so blissfully while she chewed, she'd sometimes even popped one before dinner if it was an especially trying day. Often, when tempted to peek into the drawer too early, Wendy could assuage her longing by pulling out the tiny notebook she always kept with her. It had a very slim blue pencil that perfectly fit down the spine and was nearly full of her neat, enthusiastic words. Well-thumbed pages were titled with things like Peter Pan and the Pirates and the Unexpected Zeppelin, or Peter Pan and Tiger Lily versus the Cyclops of the Cerulean Sea. And she had illustrated Captain Hook is taught a timely lesson by Peter Pan, with a little picture of a clock she had carefully copied from the mantel, as well as the eyes and nostril of a fierce crocodile, the rest of whose body she had no hope of depicting accurately, and thus chose to submerge. But today the words looked bleak and worn, and the empty lines beyond them bleaker still. Wendy couldn't resist anymore, not today, not when everything was so particularly gray and dreadful and hopeless. She slid open the creaky wooden drawer and picked up an inky soft bundle that lay neatly folded within. It shook out like a spider's web, softer than silk, without the little catchy bits that clung to rough fingers. Its outlines deformed easily. Only when she laid it out on the floor completely flat could she coax the shadow into its proper shape. Peter Pan. 4 years ago, Nana had torn it from the boy. For 4 years, Wendy had kept it carefully safe in her top drawer, waiting for Peter to come back and claim it. Michael and John gave up first. In the beginning, they had been even more exultant than she at the discovery, in Michael's case, jumping and crying and generally bouncing off the walls. John pushed his ridiculous glasses up on his nose and tried to speak in grown-up terms of actual evidence and irrefutable facts and the like. But weeks turned into months, into a year, into 4 years, and there was no more proof, no more evidence, no more sign of a visitor from Neverland. And though the boys kept stealing quick looks at the shadow, Michael soon began to remark that it was kind of crummy and a bit faded. And John muttered darkly about manifestations of another realm and meteorological phenomenon. Somehow, astonishingly, it became just another piece of bric-a-brac, a souvenir from an earlier time or an only slightly more exotic place, like the tiny mosaic mirror Mr. Darling had bought from a man who was traveling back to his home in Kashmir. But every night since then, Wendy had gone to sleep burning for Neverland. She hoped, the way some questionable but trendy pamphlets suggested, that if she thought about what she desired most of all before she fell asleep, she would dream of it. She drifted off, whispering, "Peter, I have your shadow. Peter." She often woke with a strange golden feeling, like she had just touched the boundaries of Neverland, something about wolves and strange fruit and freedom, but then quickly forgot it. The feeling never stayed. Wendy rubbed a thumb along the edge of the shadow and shuddered. If she wasn't careful, she would begin weeping. What had she done wrong? What was so repulsive about her that Peter Pan wouldn't return, even for his own shadow? What about her was so lacking that no one from Neverland ever sought her out again? She dropped the thing back into the drawer and slammed it close, crushing a knuckle into her mouth to keep from sobbing. Soon it would be time to prepare tea, and she didn't want her mother commenting about unattractive red splotches on her cheeks or rings under her eyes. In the afternoon, her brothers came home, and things should have been better. "John, Michael," Wendy said with relief as their boyish humors and exuberance filled the otherwise silent house. "Greetings, sister," John said, handing her his hat while pecking her on the cheek with a vaguely sarcastic air. He was bound for a real university someday, perhaps even Oxford, and had already begun affecting the irony necessary for a sojourn there. Michael just kicked his boots off willy-nilly and threw his coat on a chair. Of course, other families had maids to deal with such situations, but aside from the darling's lack of excessive funds, Wendy enjoyed the routine. At least, she used to. Tisking mindlessly, she picked up Michael's jacket and smoothed it out, hanging it up properly. "Wendy, you're a fool for not continuing your studies within the sphere of public education," John announced, sounding like someone else. "It's heaps of fun, too," Michael growled, a stormy look on his face. He was less subtle with sarcasm than his older brother. "Well, Father said none of the daughters of his clients go, and they are all very respectable girls. And anyway, I have all the time and books I need," she added, a little hollowly. It had seemed like the right choice to decline when her parents had, somewhat reluctantly, presented her with the option of attending one of the newfangled public schools. Why should she spend time cooped up in a crowded institution to be treated like a child, when she could have a tutor and then putter around the house, dreaming and keeping things in order like an adult? "It's dumb. I hate it. School and its stupid rules," Michael shouted. "If you don't eat your peas, you can't have your pudding. Stupid lunch matron." "Now, Michael, I'm sure they just want you to have a nutritious, healthy supper," Wendy said, feeling the comfortable role of mother easily slide over her with its delicate tones and indulgent smiles, banishing any uncertain feelings from the moment before. "Are there any of those French biscuits left?" Michael asked hopefully. "The ones you made?" "The ones I and Mother made? Perhaps. I'll set out some and serve you a nice cup of proper tea while you go upstairs and bathe. And then, if there's time, I'll tell you a story before bed." "Oh, Wendy and her stories," John said with a smile, and not quite a roll of his eyes. "I have too much reading to do, like actual reading, of actual history. Plus, Wendy, darling, I find your tales have a bit of a Freudian bent to them these days. Haven't you noticed? It's all fathers and sons and missing mothers." "I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about," she said frostily, and indeed she didn't, but his tone was nasty enough. "I want 3 lumps in my tea, and milk," Michael called over his shoulder as he stomped out of the room. "Oh," Wendy said, suddenly remembering. "Mother is supposed to come home from dinner with Mrs. Cragapple early tonight. If you hurry, you may get to say good night to her before you turn in." "Oh, yes, Mother," John said thoughtfully. "Haven't seen her in ages. Tall lady, about so high. Would absolutely love to catch up with the old hen." "John," Wendy put her hands on her hips. "Toodles, sister, off to read some more Swiss psychology. You know those Swiss, all chocolate and timepieces and subtext." John made an elaborate bow and pretended to tip the hat that was no longer there. Once he was gone, Nana curled up comfortably in her early retirement by the fire, gave Wendy the sort of questioning look that only a really intelligent dog could. "Yes, I see the muddy tracks they left on the floor," Wendy sighed. "And no, I don't know what to do about them. Boys, they grow up so fast." Now that was an interesting idea. Neverland was full of children who never grew up, but what about a boy who grew up too fast? Literally, like hatching out of an egg as a baby and then attaining the height of a man by the end of the day. They watched the egg with expectant faces, she murmured, trying it out. "What's it gonna be?" asked Cubby. "How should I know?" Peter laughed. "It'll be something great, though. You can count on that." Yes, that was lovely. She pulled out her little notebook. Now that her brothers no longer cared to hear Wendy's stories, she had to put them somewhere. And maybe, someday, someone would like to hear them again. Michael came back down, dripping wet and yet somehow barely clean. There was still chalk on his neck. He guzzled his tea and Madeline's and stomped back upstairs to play with his lead soldiers. John hadn't bothered descending yet, probably caught up in his books about real soldiers being played in the Wars of Kings. Wendy sat by herself in the kitchen, regarding the notebook and the abandoned and untouched tea plates. Madeline's were all the rage right now, and it had been wonderful spending the afternoon trying to make them with Mother. But after the first day, they'd sort of dried out and become a little tasteless. She picked one up and tentatively dipped it in her cooling tea, then nibbled its now soft edge. Much better. They almost tasted a little bit like sunshine, like warm, exotic days. Her mind whirled. Suddenly, she saw a ship bobbing in tropical waters and herself on a beach. It was another Neverland dream she was remembering, but this one had felt so real. The sailors, pirates, were singing, and Hook was bowing from the waist, as perfect and gallant as John had been awkward and foolish. In the sunshine and open air, the captain seemed far less terrifying. But maybe it was because of the wolf at her side, the one she had befriended so long ago, growling and ready to kill for her. Maybe that was why she was so brave. "A pity you can't stay here," the captain was saying. "That rapscallion utterly abandoned you to such a dismal, gray life in London town." She had frowned. "Do not talk about Peter Pan that way. You are a pirate. You make people walk the plank and burn their ships. And yet never in my most evil and wretched moments would I abandon a lady like yourself to such a fate. He really has no heart, not even a black one like mine." "I am not abandoned. He left me his shadow," she said, a little too boastfully. Hook's eyes widened at that. "You have his shadow, you say?" Wendy felt her lip quiver a little, but she stilled it. "A mistake?" "It is nothing to you, and I am fine, thank you very much." "After all those stories you told about him, all that time you devoted to enriching his legend, and this is how he treats you, by leaving you and making you be caretaker of his shadow, no less." Wendy in the dream didn't cry. She wouldn't, not in front of a villain like Hook. Wendy with the Madeline did. She put her head on her arms and wept herself to sleep. Hours later, she was gently woken by the soft touches and sweet perfume of her mother, who somehow, without actually picking up the nearly grown Wendy, managed to gather her daughter in her arms and gently lead her upstairs. "What in the blazes is wrong with her?" Mr. Darling growled, asleep at the table like a serving wench. "Shh," Miss Darling cooed. She gestured with her hand, making him scoop up the notebook Wendy took with her everywhere. "Mother?" Wendy murmured, waking a little. "Oh, Mother, you look so beautiful." "Thank you, dear. You're so sweet." Miss Darling helped her out of her dress and fixed her hair, more shadowy apparition of eyelashes and perfect coif than parent of stuff and substance. Wendy enjoyed being treated like a little girl again. She snuggled into her bed drowsily and heard her parents talk. "Something's got to be done about her," Mr. Darling swore, shaking the notebook for emphasis. "There's something not quite right about that girl. She's just a little blue. She needs a project," Miss Darling said. "A boy, or maybe a charity." "Charity? How about a Darling charity?" Mr. Darling huffed. "Courtships are all very well and good, but require dresses and hats and all sort of expensive shenanigans. That was always the advantage of Wendy. She never wanted the things other girls had." "No," Miss Darling said with a touch of sadness. "She always wanted something else." And Wendy dreamed quickly forgotten dreams of foreign seas and wolves. And that is the end of the first chapter of Straight On Till Morning by Liz Braswell. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. Check back with me next week where we read another first chapter. Have a great rest of your week.